em và quý khách tới để dự buổi nói chuyện ngày hôm nay. Viện bảo tàng đã đóng cửa một năm và đây là buổi thuyết trình live đầu tiên. Và trong thời gian đó các anh chị em ở đây vẫn tiếp tục làm việc để duy trì và phát triển viện bảo tàng. Thành ra hôm nay rất là hân hạnh để có một vị diễn giả là một tác giả viết về những cuốn sách rất quý về chiến tranh Việt Nam. Nhưng mà hôm nay cũng là gần ngày 30 tháng 4, 46 năm trước là ngày Quốc hận, khi mà Cộng sản cưỡng chiếm miền Nam. Vậy thì trước khi bắt đầu chương trình, xin mời mọi người đứng dậy để làm lễ chào quốc kỳ. National Anthem of the Republic of Việt Nam. The National Anthem of the United States of America. Đứng để có một phút mặc niệm cho những chiến sĩ đã hy sinh bảo vệ cho nền dân chủ của miền Nam Việt Nam và những người đã bỏ mạng tại những trại tù cải tạo và những người đã mất trên đường tìm tự do trên đường vượt biên. Xin mời quý vị an toàn. I'm just going to have a few words in Vietnamese. Xin giới thiệu hôm nay diễn giả hôm nay là ông George Veith. George J Veith là một cựu sĩ quan trong bộ binh US Army. J Veith đã bỏ rất nhiều thời gian 20 năm nghiên cứu về chiến tranh Việt Nam và được viết 4 cuốn sách là Operation Bright Light, Leave No Man Behind, cuốn gần đây nhất là cuốn Black April, mọi người đều biết đến. Hôm nay ông ta sẽ giới thiệu cuốn sách mới nhất là cuốn Drawn Sword in Distant Land. Đây là một cuốn sách nói về nói về chính trị và cái sự chính trị và sự về kinh tế và những cái thăng trầm của nền đề nhị Cộng hòa. Và ông ta đã nghiên cứu rất nhiều qua những cuộc phỏng vấn với các cựu chiến sĩ. Và I would like to introduce our speaker today, author George J Veith, a prominent historian and who's done a lot of research in the Vietnam War. He has published 4 books on the Vietnam War, and he's here to speak to us about his newest book, which is titled Drawn Swords in the Distant Land. So with no further ado, this is Mr. Veith.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kwan. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to talk for the next hour. Hopefully you can hear me okay with this. And the slides are going to be both in English and in Vietnamese. Okay? And I think we're going to hold questions to the end. Is that right? Okay. So, what I want to do today is really talk about the political history of South Vietnam. So Black April is a, there we go, we'll skip my smiling face. So really, Black April was a military book. It was only military. It talked about the last 2 years of the war. And my goal with that book was to show that the South Vietnamese soldiers did try to fight very hard, despite what many people think about them. So this book is the other side of that coin. It is an attempt to write about how the South Vietnamese government tried to build the country, how it tried to improve the lives of its people, how it tried to build democracy while at war. And so the book really talks about the South Vietnamese government's successes and its failures in that endeavor, right? To try and show that it was trying to really improve the lives of the people. So, sorry if I'm blocking you guys. So what I want you to come away from this talk is hopefully you'll get a deeper appreciation for some of the efforts that the government tried to do to improve the people. And I hope that for the people who maybe have been young at the time or have just learned about it from history books, that you'll have a deeper appreciation now and some more respect and pride for your own country and accomplishments. That's my goal anyways. So here's the Vietnamese version, which I will skip through very quickly, sorry. So we're going to start at the very beginning, because the problem with history is that it always has an echo into the present. So when Ngo Dinh Diem came into South Vietnam from Bao Dai, there was a French Vietnamese general named Nguyen Van Hinh who was in charge of the Vietnamese National Army, and Hinh represented the military, which believed that a civilian was not the right person to lead Vietnam, that they had to have somebody in the military, somebody strong and organized. So Hinh threatened Ziam with a coup, and that coup failed, but the effort that he did, the attempt to do that, stayed with Ziam for a long time. And because he did that, it made him very suspicious of the military. Now, there were some other things with both Nguyen Van Thieu and Tran Chiem Kim, is that they joined something called the Eagle Party, which made Ziam very suspicious of them. All right. So again, echoes through time. So, skipping forward a little bit, the VC launched the first attack in January of 1960, and what happens is, because Ziam had been so suspicious of the military, he tried to put loyal officers in charge, but these loyal officers were not very good. And so the more professional military officers like Chun Van Don and those guys began to start thinking maybe it's time for Ziam to go. So again, starting to move through history. Shortly thereafter, the military began to be very restless over President Ziam, and so they launched what called the paratrooper coup, the airborne brigade, the new ranger group, a Marine battalion, went into Saigon. And so what you see is it wasn't just the airborne guys, it was some of the most elite troops in the South Vietnamese military. They surround the palace, and Win Con jumps the fence, goes into the palace. He summons people from the south. They came up. The paratroopers flee. But again, now Ziam is even more suspicious of the military. So, again, move very fast because the book is 24 chapters. Only the first 3 chapters go through up to the coup of '63. Because if you look at the American history, or the books that have been written, you see that there are 8 books on President Ziam and 0 on anything that comes after that. So 85% of my book is everything after the coup. They talk about after President Ziam. So well, one of the things that I go into in the book is people have talked about the political stuff and were the Americans involved in the coup. But no one has ever really discussed how it physically happened in Saigon, right? So General Ton Tet Din had planned the assault. Colonel Tu, who was in charge of the 5th Division at the time, was the main leader of the coup forces. But there was a very specific plan. And that plan was to surround the palace, but not launch an assault. And the reason, any military guy here will know this, is that they didn't want to create casualties. They didn't want a firefight. They didn't want Vietnamese killing each other. So they surrounded the palace, but Ziam and his brother escaped. Now, Chiu and Zin and Chen Tien Kin, all those guys joined the coup for one reason, and that was because they were promised by General Yung Ben Min that nothing would happen to Zim, the President Ziam. He would be treated kindly, sent out of the country, all right? So when President Ziam and his brother called them the next morning, and Min sent his aide to go get him, Chiu and all those guys were pushed to the side. And I discuss in the book precisely what happened, how he was killed, who gave the orders, as much as we can tell, right? So there's a great discussion in here of try to scrape away some of the mistruths that have gone on about the coup and who was responsible for it and who was responsible for the death of President Ziam. Okay? Now, the coup happens, General Min takes over, and this is a tremendous shift a beginning of a tremendous shift in how the South Vietnamese government began to look at how it governed, right? Ziam was a person who believed in top-down, okay? Top-down management. General Min took over, I'm sorry about this. He takes over, and his idea is now to become a more inclusive government. Ziam had repressed the Cao Dai and the Wa'ao. He had repressed the Dai Viets and the VNQDD. So Min was trying to build a more inclusive government. And he was trying to do that for one reason, because he was trying to get the people, and he had launched a coup because he thought the people no longer supported Ziam. Whether that was true or not, that's what he believed. So he's trying to get all these people now to join the government to fight the communists. And when he had that, he would then try to get what he thought was the non-communists in the National Liberation Front to leave them and to join them in a government that was for all the people, and then they would have something to push the communists out. Right? So that was his idea. But the problem with that is that he had no longer begun to do that when there was a counter coup. And Win Con takes over. Now, for those of you who don't know, Win Con was a figurehead. He was put there by the Dai Viets. And there's a lot of discussion about, and this is again something that no one's ever heard about. Behind the scenes, there was a lot of people who didn't want, were trying to get Min out. And so, I'm going to details, they began to bring in General Kim and General Tu and that's on Colonel VN, right, to prevent what they thought was an attempt by the generals, General Min, General Lee Van Kim, General Chen Van Dan, to neutralize the country. And so the Dai Viet helped launch the counter coup, and Win Khan takes over. But Win Khan was not the puppet that they thought he was going to be. So he brings back the Dai Viet leader in France, Juan, I'll go to the Vietnamese, sorry. And he gives him all of the ministries, except for a couple, right? And he promises him, listen, let me just run the war and you handle everything else. But what happens is they quickly have a falling out. Khan becomes to take over more and more. And by April of '64, the Dai Viets are on the way out. So, but at the same time, right after the coup, the communists began to send in more. They began to send in a lot of arms into South Vietnam. They began to send in the cadre that had gone from the southern Vietnam in '54 back up, and they began to build bigger and bigger and stronger units. So while Min and all these guys, Khan thought with President Ziam gone, the NLF will give up their arms, they could not have been more wrong. Instead, the communists saw the coup as a chance to take over the country. So they launched bigger attacks, massive attacks. There was more battalion-sized incidents in July of '64 than in the previous 3 years. So with that as a background, with the war going badly, when Khan begins to secretly reach out to the NLF to try to have a peace. Same thing that General Min had tried to do. He tried to convince them that if we Southerners get together, we can kick out the Northerners, send the commies to the north. Then you had the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Khan attempts to even take over more with the Vung Tau Charter, but the Buddhists revolted again. And there was a massive surge of uprising, a massive surge of protests, and the country is not doing very well. There was another coup attempt in September, and it's turned back by Win Tao Ki and some of the people called the Young Turks, who were some of the, not quite the senior generals, not quite the senior generals, but they were some of the troop commanders, right? Some of the younger officers. And they were tired of sort of the Win Khan and the coup things that were going on. But stopping the coup in '64 moved these guys to the very top of the power echelon. But Win Kao Ki and the other generals, they were tired of coups. They wanted the military out of politics. So they began to push civilians into leadership. And there's a couple other guys, but I'm only talking about Dr. Quat. And this is something very also I want you to remember. And there's some key points that we want to talk about in my speech, where South Vietnam could have gone this way or gone that way. And this is one of the key turning points, is that there was this Buddhist leader who began to first publicly talk about we need to have peace talks with the NLF. Now this had been a red line. Any kind of that kind of talk would instantly get you a visit from the police. But because he began to talk about it, it forced Quat to publicly announce what South Vietnam's peace terms would be. Not what the Americans wanted, not what the North Vietnamese wanted, what the South Vietnamese government wanted. And there was a couple of very distinct points. No coalition. Any communists who wanted to stay can go north. If you want peace, happy to have it. We'll sign a peace treaty with you. But commies go north, we stay here. And this was the first time that someone had actually said from the South Vietnamese government, what we will give, what our peace policies are. And this was actually done by civilians, not by the military. So this effort to create a civilian government, to get the military out of politics, started far earlier than most people realize. But unfortunately, it didn't. Now, here's another key point. So Quat holds provincial elections, and they have elections to just have these provincial county council members not taking over the government, not taking over the province leadership, but just elected officials. And this is the very first time that they have had free elections in South Vietnam, and it is the beginning, which people don't know, but it is the beginning of the attempt to create democracy in South Vietnam. Because the people who are elected to these councils will begin to push the military to move out of power, to let the civilians take over. Okay? But at the same time, when Quat resigns, because of Vietnamese, sorry, the generals elect Nguyen Van Thieu as the chief of state and Nguyen Cao Ky as the prime minister. Ky holds all the power. Thieu is a figurehead. He can sign decrees and stuff like that, but it's Ky that holds all the power. All right. Now, again, one of these key turning points. Right? So, the war is turning very badly. Again, when South Vietnam was looking very desperate, the communists took that as an opportunity not to seek peace, but to win the war. So they sent first North Vietnamese division south, the 325 division. It came south, and it got into the Central Highlands, and they were trying to cut the country in half in the Quang Ngai area. Okay, now you have to remember something. So McNamara and Westmoreland, and it's a very important meeting in July of 1965. It is not the Americans who asked to come into the war. It is Thieu and Nguyen Cao Ky who asked the Americans to send troops, because they are very afraid that the country was this close to falling. All right? Now, but here's a key thing. Thieu says to McNamara, okay, we need American troops. We want you guys to stay out of the villages. Go into the country, fight the North Vietnamese. We'll guard the villages. But Westmoreland said no. Sorry for the skipping back and forth. Now, so Ky takes over, right? I want you to remember what I said before. General Minh had come in, trying to change how the government of South Vietnam treated its people, right? To build a more inclusive government. Ky takes that a step further. He wants to launch a social revolution. He wants to improve, he wants the government to try and improve the lives of the people, okay? And this is the beginning of a change in how the South Vietnamese government looked at its people and treated its people. And so, in this, October of '65, they're holding a meeting with the province chiefs. They're trying to improve pacification. American troops have come in, they have stopped the communist offensive, the military situation is stabilized. Okay, what's our next step? Now we've got to go back and win the countryside back from the VC, right? So they hold this meeting, right? And again, this is one of those very important changes in South Vietnam history. Dr. Quat says to Ky and to Thieu, okay, we held these provincial elections back in May. Now it's time for the military to step aside. We need to start moving down the path towards democracy. Thieu agrees. Ky not so much. Thieu agrees, right? And he begins a plan to start moving the military out of the government and giving it back to the civilians. And again, this is this subtle change like this that could have been very different without Thieu's leadership. And we're going to come back to that in a second, but I also want to emphasize to you is that as 1966 begins, and with this emphasis now on helping the people, the government begins to change. how it treats the people, right? And refugee care, because the war had created 1 million refugees. I mean, it's literally almost 15% of the South Vietnamese population are living in these Spartan camps. No food, very little water, no education, no health care. And this guy, Dr. Quay, who he had promoted, begins to change things. And one of the things he does is that he says, okay, we need people to work in the camps. All the men are in the army, so who are we going to get? And what he begins to do, and this is something that I wish I had more information on, he starts to hire women into these roles, right? And he begins a shift in how gender roles were done in South Vietnam. He begins a real effort to create social justice by improving health care for women, by hiring a female nurse to work for maternity wards, by improving education. And this is something that I wish I knew more about, but it kind of surprised me, was it begins to change traditional roles in South Vietnamese society. And then the other issue is the economy. And when we all talk about the war and we look at this battle and we talk about that general, the thing you've got to remember about war is somebody's got to pay for all those soldiers. They've got to pay for all those bullets and guns and feed them and feed the wounded and take care of the wounded, right? Well, how are you going to do that in a country that has no income tax, that has no ability to generate revenue other than import duties? The South Vietnamese economic model was from the French. So you got two options. Get it from the Americans, which they did, or you start printing money. And when you start printing money, what happens? Inflation skyrockets. And this becomes a huge issue. Second only to the war. And the price of rice goes up because the VC had cut off the roads into Saigon. All the people who have been farming for all those years are now refugees, not farming, right? So suddenly you have this huge spike in prices. And it becomes, after the war itself, the second most important issue in South Vietnam. Okay, glad you're still awake. So, here we go. As anti-war pressure builds in America, President Johnson wants to meet with Chiu and Key. And he asks them to come to Honolulu. And this is a critical meeting, right? And at this meeting, even though he's under tremendous pressure in America, he agrees to spend a lot of money to help pacification in South Vietnam. And this money, in fact, the U.S. aid budget, 1/4 of the U.S. aid budget for '66 went to South Vietnam. The largest sum ever spent on any country in the history of American economic aid, okay? And it's this money that enables the South Vietnamese government to spread out back into the countryside. But, because nothing is ever easy in South Vietnam, he comes back and General Chi in I Corps begins to start causing trouble. Chi goes to visit him, they have a big fight, he fires Chi, and the Buddhists use this as an excuse to launch a second uprising, all right? What is known as the struggles. So, but let's go back to our theme of democracy and trying to build democracy. So Chiu and Key had announced this plan how they were going to switch the government from a military government back over to civilian, but it was a long drawn out plan based upon gaining security in the countryside, okay? Buddhists didn't want that. They wanted immediate elections. And they're like, no, we can't have immediate elections when half the country is controlled by the VC. So eventually, Key moves to retake Da Nang, and then he moves to take Back Way. He arrests Khan, sends him to Saigon. The Buddhist thing is over. But because the Buddhists had pushed so hard to get elections, they had agreed to speed up the process, which becomes another key moment in South Vietnamese history. So, they create a committee, all right? And the committee creates an election law. And we're going to have an election in September of 1966, and they draft this election law, which means, okay, who can vote, who can run for office? These are the hallmarks of democracy, right? And they drafted a surprisingly liberal law. As long as you were Vietnamese by birth, you had no criminal or communist marks against you, and there's a third one I can't remember off the top of my head right now, you could vote, and you could run for office. For a country at war that had never known democracy,